He was about 6 feet tall, that he was completely scourged all over his body. He was crucified, and nobody dies for a lie.
The year is 2004. A Hollywood director, one of the most powerful men in the entertainment industry, bets his entire career, his reputation, and $30 million of his own money on a film that every major studio refused to touch. They told him it would fail. They told him audiences wouldn't show up. They told him he was finished. That film grossed $622 million worldwide. And here's what nobody talks about. The story behind it almost broke him completely. Today we're going deep. Mel Gibson, Joe Rogan, the Bible, ancient history, archaeological evidence. A conversation that will genuinely make you stop and think, whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between. If you're new here, subscribe now, because we cover the conversations the mainstream won't touch. Deep dives into history, culture, faith, and the big questions that shape how we understand the world. Today's video is one we've been building toward for a long time. We're walking through what a conversation between Mel Gibson and Joe Rogan would look like, and more importantly, what it reveals about the Bible, history, human civilization, and why millions of rational people across every culture and century have staked their lives on a collection of ancient texts. This isn't a religious lecture. It's not an atheist takedown. It's an investigation. So let me start with one question. Have you actually investigated the Bible? Or have you just decided what you think about it? Mel Gibson's story. Let's talk about Mel Gibson first, because his story is the entry point into everything we're going to explore today. Most people know Mel Gibson as an action star, Lethal Weapon, Braveheart, Mad Max. But fewer people know the full arc of what happened to him in the early 2000s and why it matters to this conversation. By 2002, Gibson was quietly in crisis. Publicly, everything looked fine, but privately, he was wrestling with profound questions about meaning, mortality, and faith. He had grown up in a deeply traditional Catholic household. His father, Hutton Gibson, was a well-known traditionalist who held uncompromising views on scripture and church doctrine. Mel had absorbed a reverence for the Bible from childhood, but Hollywood has a way of eroding certainty. And then something shifted. Gibson became consumed, and that's not too strong a word, by the passion narratives. The final hours of Jesus of Nazareth, as recorded in the 4 Gospels. He read them over and over. He studied the history. He consulted theologians, historians, and linguists. And what he found was that the Gospel accounts, when placed against the backdrop of first-century Roman-occupied Judea, were extraordinarily historically coherent. The Roman method of crucifixion, the role of the Sanhedrin, the geography of Jerusalem, the political tension between Herod Antipas, Pontius Pilate, and the Jewish religious establishment. The details were not the stuff of mythology. They were specific, verifiable, and consistent with what historians know about that period. So he made the film, The Passion of the Christ, in Aramaic and Latin, with no major studio backing, with his own money on the line. And here's the question I want you to sit with for a second. Why would a man at the peak of his Hollywood power risk everything, his career, his money, his reputation, on a story he believed was fiction? He wouldn't. Nobody does that. Now, enter Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is one of the most listened-to voices on the planet. Tens of millions of people tune into the Joe Rogan Experience every week. And what makes Rogan interesting in this context is that he is genuinely curious. He is not a committed Christian. He describes himself as someone who finds the idea of organized religion complicated. But he is also deeply respectful of the evidence and deeply suspicious of dismissive, incurious skepticism. Rogan has talked about the Bible on his podcast multiple times, and some of what he said is genuinely fascinating. He's made the point, and this is important, that the sheer historical persistence of the Bible demands explanation. This is not a book that survived because it was convenient. It survived persecution, burning, banning, and the collapse of entire empires. People died rather than renounce it. And Rogan's question, the one that cuts right to the heart of things, is this: why? Why would millions of people across thousands of years, from vastly different cultures and time periods, choose death over abandoning a book of myths? That's not a rhetorical question. That's a real one, and it deserves a real answer. The Skeptic's Challenge. Now, before we go any further, I want to make space for the skeptics, because you deserve to be heard. Here's the strongest version of the skeptical case, and I'm going to give it to you straight. The Bible, critics argue, is a collection of texts written by human beings in specific historical and political contexts with specific agendas. The Old Testament was compiled over centuries. Different books have different authors. There are internal contradictions. There are stories that appear to borrow from earlier Near Eastern traditions. The flood narrative, for example, has parallels in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the biblical account. The New Testament, critics point out, was written decades after the events it describes. Paul's letters, the earliest New Testament writings, date to roughly 20 years after the crucifixion. The Gospels themselves were written between 40 and 90 years after Jesus' death. And the process by which the biblical canon was established, which books were included and which were excluded, was a human, institutional process involving church councils and political considerations. Add to this the fact that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the Bible makes some of the most extraordinary claims in human history. Virgin birth, resurrection, miracles, prophecy. That's the skeptic's case. And it's not stupid. It's a serious case made by serious people. So here's my question for you, right now, watching this. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much have you actually investigated the evidence on both sides? Not what you were told, not what social media tells you, but actually investigated. Because here's what's interesting. Most people, believers and skeptics alike, have a confidence level that dramatically outpaces their actual research. The person who says the Bible is obviously mythology has usually read far less of it, and far less scholarship about it, than they realize. And the person who says every word is literally true has often engaged with fewer of the hard questions than they're comfortable admitting. The conversation between Gibson and Rogan, hypothetically, honestly pursued, would force both sides into the discomfort zone. And that's exactly where the most interesting things happen. The archaeological evidence. Let's get into the evidence, because this is where things get genuinely extraordinary. For much of the 18th and 19th centuries, skeptical scholars argued that much of the Old Testament was essentially historical fiction. Places mentioned in the Bible, cities, kingdoms, people groups, couldn't be verified archaeologically. The assumption was, no evidence means it didn't happen. Then the archaeologists started digging, and what they found changed the conversation dramatically. The Pool of Siloam. Mentioned in the Gospel of John as the place where Jesus healed a blind man. For centuries, skeptics said no such pool existed. In 2004, the same year The Passion of the Christ was released, incidentally, construction workers in Jerusalem accidentally uncovered the actual Pool of Siloam. Exactly where John said it was. Exactly from the right time period. The Tel Dan Stele. For a long time, critics argued that King David was a mythological figure, that there was no historical evidence for a Davidic monarchy. Then in 1993, archaeologists discovered a stone inscription at Tel Dan in northern Israel. It referenced, explicitly, the House of David. This was a non-biblical external source, written in ancient Aramaic, confirming the existence of the Davidic dynasty. The inscription dates to the 9th century BC, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who presides over Jesus' trial in all four Gospels. Skeptics once questioned whether Pilate was even a historical figure. In 1961, a limestone block was discovered at Caesarea Maritima, a Roman theater. Carved into it, a dedicatory inscription bearing the name Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea. He was real. He was exactly who the Gospels said he was. The Hittites. The Old Testament makes repeated reference to a people called the Hittites. For generations, skeptics pointed to the absence of any archaeological evidence for the Hittites as proof that the Bible was inventing history. Then, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, archaeologists uncovered an entire Hittite civilization in modern-day Turkey. Thousands of cuneiform tablets. A massive empire that had been entirely forgotten by history and perfectly remembered by the Bible, Jericho. The city whose walls, according to the book of Joshua, fell during the Israelite conquest of Canaan. Archaeological excavations at Tel es-Sultan, the site of ancient Jericho, have confirmed that the city was indeed a fortified settlement in the late Bronze Age. The debate about the precise dating of its destruction continues among scholars, but the city was real, the walls were real, and the destruction layer is real. Now, here's where Joe Rogan would lean forward in his chair, because Rogan has a specific kind of reaction to this kind of information. He's talked about it in different contexts. This feeling of realizing that something you dismissed without investigation turns out to be far more layered than you thought. And the pattern with biblical archaeology is remarkable. Time after time, claims that were confidently dismissed as legend have turned out to be historically grounded. Does that prove the theological claims of the Bible? No. That's a separate question entirely. But it does something important. It establishes that the biblical texts are historically serious documents, written by people with genuine knowledge of real places, real events, and real political structures. These are not the characteristics of pure mythology. Here's a question for you. Did you know about any of this evidence before watching this video? If not, and for most people the answer is no, ask yourself why. Why isn't this the first thing we talk about when we talk about the Bible? The New Testament under the microscope. Now let's turn to the New Testament. This is where the stakes get highest and the questions get hardest. The central claim of the New Testament is not just historical, it's metaphysical. It's not just Jesus of Nazareth existed, it's Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. And that claim is either the most important thing that has ever happened in human history, or it is the most consequential lie ever told. There is no comfortable middle ground. Mel Gibson understood this. It's why he couldn't make a comfortable film. The Passion of the Christ is brutal, precisely because Gibson believed he was depicting a real event. And a real event of that magnitude demands to be taken seriously, not softened for palatability. So let's look at what the historical evidence actually says. First, did Jesus exist? This question is actually far less controversial among historians than popular culture suggests. The overwhelming consensus of ancient historians, including those who are not Christian and have no theological stake in the matter, is that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical figure. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 116 AD, references the execution of Christus under Pontius Pilate. Tacitus was not a Christian. He was a Roman aristocrat who regarded Christianity with contempt. He had no reason to invent this reference. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the late 1st century, makes two references to Jesus, one of which scholars largely agree contains at least a historical core despite later Christian additions. The Babylonian Talmud contains references to a figure named Yeshu, almost certainly Jesus, being executed. So the historical existence of Jesus is about as well attested as any figure from antiquity. Now, the harder question, the resurrection. Here is what historians can say with a high degree of confidence based on the documentary evidence. 1. The tomb was empty. Even the earliest critics of Christianity didn't dispute the empty tomb. They explained it by claiming the disciples stole the body. But notice, they didn't deny the tomb was empty. 2. The disciples reported experiences of seeing Jesus alive after his death. This is historically documented. The question is what those experiences were. 3. The transformation of the disciples is itself a historical phenomenon that requires explanation. These were men who, at the time of the crucifixion, were terrified and hiding. Within weeks, they were publicly proclaiming the resurrection in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus had been executed, and they were willing to die for that proclamation. Most of them did. Now here's what Joe Rogan would say at this point, and he's said versions of this about other topics. You can dismiss a lot of things, but when you've got people who were actually there, who saw whatever they saw, who then chose death over saying they made it up, that's not nothing. That requires an explanation. And he's right. The explanations available are essentially these. The disciples were lying, the disciples were hallucinating, or the disciples were telling the truth. The lying hypothesis is the hardest to sustain. People lie for gain. The disciples gained nothing material from their claims. They gained persecution, exile, imprisonment, and execution. The psychological profile of people who maintain an elaborate lie under those conditions is essentially non-existent. The hallucinating hypothesis has its own problems. Mass hallucinations of the specific, interactive, extended kind described in the resurrection accounts don't match anything we understand about how hallucinations work. And Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, lists over 500 people who claim to have seen Jesus after the resurrection, including people who were still alive at the time of writing, available for questioning. This doesn't prove the resurrection happened, but it demonstrates that the question is far more serious, far less easily dismissed than most people assume. What do you think? Drop it in the comments right now. Lying, hallucinating, or something else? I read every comment. Mel Gibson, Joe Rogan, and the culture war. Let's zoom out for a moment. Part of what makes a hypothetical Gibson-Rogan conversation so electric is that both men exist at a very specific cultural moment, and they represent something important about where we are as a society. We are living through a period of profound spiritual disorientation. Traditional religious institutions have lost authority. The scientific establishment, once seen as a replacement for religion, has its own credibility crises. Social media has fragmented our shared reality, and millions of people, particularly young men, are searching for something that gives life coherence, meaning, and weight. Joe Rogan's audience is disproportionately male, disproportionately young, and disproportionately spiritually searching. These are not people who have found peace in secular materialism. They are people who sense that the everything is random and nothing matters worldview is psychologically unlivable, but who haven't found a compelling alternative. Mel Gibson represents something they rarely encounter, a man who has operated at the absolute apex of worldly success, fame, wealth, power, talent, and who found it insufficient. Who found that the thing that gave his life its deepest meaning was not Hollywood, but an ancient story about suffering, death, and resurrection. That's a powerful testimony. Not because Gibson is morally perfect, he would be the first to say he is not, but because his very imperfection makes the point more forcefully. The faith he holds is not the faith of someone who has everything figured out. It is the faith of someone who has looked into the abyss and found something looking back. And that resonates with Rogan's audience in a way that polished, institutional religion rarely does. Rogan himself has edged toward this territory. He's talked about the psychedelic experiences that convinced him there is something beyond ordinary material reality. He's talked about the work of people like Graham Hancock. Controversial, but pointing toward the idea that human civilization and human consciousness are far more ancient and far more mysterious than the mainstream narrative allows. And here's the thing, If you're open to the idea that there are profound mysteries about human consciousness and human history that we don't yet understand, which Rogan clearly is, then the Bible's claims don't look like an embarrassing relic of pre-scientific superstition. They start to look like one of the most ancient and serious human attempts to grapple with those mysteries. The question is whether you're willing to look at it with fresh eyes, and that's not easy, because most of us have already decided what we think about the Bible, often without having seriously investigated it. And it takes genuine intellectual courage to revisit a conclusion you've already made. The prophecy question. Now, I want to take you somewhere that I think is genuinely underexplored in these conversations, and it's the section I'd most want to see Gibson and Rogan dig into together. Biblical prophecy. This is controversial territory. But follow me here, because the specifics are more remarkable than the general idea. The book of Isaiah was written in the 8th century BC. Among its contents is a passage, Isaiah 53, that describes a figure who is despised and rejected by people, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Christians read this as a prophecy of Jesus of Nazareth, written 700 years before his birth. Now, the skeptical response is that this is pattern matching after the fact, that you can find anything in a sufficiently long text if you're looking for it. That's a fair concern. But here's what makes this specific case interesting. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956 at Qumran, include a complete copy of the Book of Isaiah. This manuscript has been carbon dated to approximately 125 BC. That is more than a century before the birth of Jesus, which means, whatever Isaiah 53 means, it was not written after the fact to match Jesus' story. It existed, in essentially identical form to what we have today, before Jesus was born. You can still argue it's coincidence. You can still argue that early Christians shaped the narrative of Jesus' life to fit Isaiah's words. These are legitimate debates. But here's what you cannot honestly argue, that the text was fabricated after the fact. The Dead Sea Scrolls settled that. Now let's look at another one. The prophet Micah, writing in the 8th century BC, specifically named Bethlehem as the birthplace of a coming ruler of Israel. Micah 5:2. Not Jerusalem, not Nazareth, Bethlehem. Matthew and Luke both record Jesus as being born in Bethlehem, and they record this in a context that makes sense historically. The Roman census that brought Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem. Coincidence? Maybe. But the specificity is striking. And then there's Daniel. The book of Daniel contains what many scholars, including non-Christian scholars, regard as some of the most remarkably specific predictive content in ancient literature. Daniel 9 contains what's known as the 70 weeks prophecy, a complex chronological calculation that, depending on the interpretive method used, appears to point to a specific time frame that corresponds to the period of Jesus' public ministry. Now, full transparency. The interpretation of Daniel is genuinely contested. The book's dating is debated. The precise meaning of the chronology is disputed. But here's the bottom line. Serious scholars, not fringe figures, but peer-reviewed academic historians, have spent centuries wrestling with this material. And the reason they keep wrestling with it is because it refuses to be easily dismissed. Mel Gibson would know this material. He's a student of this tradition, and he would put it to Rogan this way: Joe, I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm asking you to seriously consider the probability. Because when you stack the prophecies, the archaeology, the manuscript evidence, and the historical witness of the early church, the picture you get is not the picture of mythology. It's the picture of something that happened. And Rogan, being Rogan, would sit with that for a moment. And then he'd ask the question that cuts deepest. But Mel, why? Why would the creator of the universe do it this way? Why a small province in the Roman Empire? Why not something undeniable? And this is the question that every serious believer has to wrestle with. The traditional theological answer is that faith, genuine faith, requires something that certainty would destroy. That a God who made belief rationally compulsory would be removing the very thing that makes love, trust, and relationship meaningful. Whether that satisfies you is a deeply personal question, but it is not an irrational answer. The manuscript evidence. Let's talk about something that almost never comes up in casual conversations about the Bible, and it should. The manuscript evidence for the New Testament is unlike anything else in ancient history. Here's some context. How do we know what Julius Caesar wrote? We have about 10 surviving manuscripts of Gallic Wars, the earliest of which dates to about 900 years after Caesar wrote it. Historians accept these manuscripts as reliable without serious controversy. How do we know what Plato wrote? About 210 manuscripts, the earliest dating to about 1,300 years after Plato. How do we know what Homer wrote? About 643 manuscripts of the Iliad. Now, the New Testament. There are over 5,800 surviving Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. The earliest fragments date to within decades of the original writings. The Chester Beatty Papyri, for example, date to approximately 200 AD. The John Rylands Papyrus, a fragment of the Gospel of John, dates to approximately 117 to 138 AD. That is within living memory of the Apostle John himself. When you add Latin, Coptic, Syriac, and other ancient translations, the total manuscript count exceeds 25,000 documents. No other ancient text comes close, not even remotely. And here's what textual scholars will tell you. The degree of consistency across these manuscripts is remarkable. The variations that exist are almost entirely minor. Spelling differences, word order differences. The theological content of the New Testament is stable across the entire manuscript tradition. This matters because one of the most common skeptical claims, that the Bible has been changed over the centuries, like a game of telephone, is simply not supported by the manuscript evidence. We can cross-reference thousands of manuscripts from different centuries and different geographic regions. The text holds. Joe Rogan, if presented with this information directly, would likely say something he's said before about other topics. I didn't know that. Why don't people talk about this? And the honest answer is because it's inconvenient for certain narratives on both sides. Extreme skeptics don't like it because it undermines the corrupted text argument, and some religious communities don't emphasize it because they're more comfortable with faith-based appeals than evidence-based ones. But the evidence is the evidence, and the manuscript evidence for the New Testament is genuinely extraordinary. The personal dimension. We've covered a lot of ground: archaeology, history, manuscripts, prophecy, philosophy. But here's what Gibson would bring to the table that pure intellectual argument can't provide: the testimony of lived experience. Gibson has spoken publicly about periods in his life when he was in profound darkness, depression, addiction, the sense of meaninglessness that can hollow out even the most externally successful life. And he has spoken about faith not as an intellectual position, but as something more like a lifeline. This is the dimension of the biblical tradition that no archaeological find and no manuscript count can fully address, and yet it may be the most important dimension of all. Across 2,000 years and every culture on earth, hundreds of millions of people have reported that engagement with the biblical text, prayer, community, reading, practice, transformed them, broke destructive cycles, healed relationships, gave them the capacity to forgive the unforgivable, helped them face death without despair. This is not nothing. This is a massive, distributed, cross-cultural data set of human experience. The skeptic can say it's placebo. The believer can say it's the presence of God. But both have to account for the same data. Rogan has talked about transformation in his own life, through discipline, through martial arts, through psychedelics, through honest conversation. He understands at a gut level that human beings are not purely rational creatures, and that meaning is not a luxury but a necessity. The Bible's claim is that the meaning human beings are searching for is not constructed, it's discovered. That the universe is not indifferent, that the story we find ourselves in is not random, and that the evidence for this is written into history, into human experience, and into the structure of reality itself. You don't have to agree with that claim. But if you're the kind of person who listens to Joe Rogan, if you're the kind of person who is curious, who takes ideas seriously, who isn't satisfied with easy answers, then you owe it to yourself to investigate it seriously, not to believe uncritically, not to dismiss reflexively, but to actually look. Let me bring this home. Mel Gibson bet $30 million on a story, not because he was naive, not because he hadn't encountered the skeptical arguments, but because he had investigated seriously, rigorously, personally, and he found the evidence more compelling than the dismissal. Joe Rogan has built a $200 million media empire on one simple principle: be genuinely curious and have the courage to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it's uncomfortable. The Bible deserves to be treated with that same standard, not the standard of, I already know what I think, and I'm not going to be embarrassed by entertaining this. Not the standard of, my tribe believes this, so I believe it without examination. But the standard of genuine, rigorous, open-minded investigation. Here is what the evidence establishes. The biblical texts are historically serious documents, consistent with verifiable archaeological and historical data in ways that continue to surprise scholars. The New Testament is the most well-attested ancient document in human history by a factor that dwarfs everything else. The central claims of the New Testament, that Jesus existed, was executed under Pontius Pilate, and was reported risen by eyewitnesses who died for that report, are historically documented facts that demand explanation. The explanations available range from elaborate collective delusion to the most important event in human history. Which of those you find more plausible is a question only you can answer. But here's my challenge to you, and this is the thing I want you to take away from this video. Don't answer that question based on what you've always assumed. Answer it based on what you've actually investigated. Read the Gospels, not summaries of them, not critiques of them, the actual texts. They take 4 hours total. Read one book of serious archaeology. William Dever, Israel Finkelstein, Kenneth Kitchen, scholars who have spent their careers digging in the ground. Read one serious historical examination of the resurrection. N.T. Wright, Bart Ehrman, Gary Habermas, perspectives from across the belief spectrum. And then form your opinion. Because this is the question, the oldest and most important question in human history. Is this true? Not. Is it comfortable? Not. Does my social circle accept it? Not. Will I look sophisticated if I dismiss it? Is it true? Mel Gibson answered that question for himself, at enormous personal and professional cost. Joe Rogan answers it new every day, with curiosity and without pretense. The invitation is open to you. If this video made you think, even a little, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that conversations like this one deserve to reach more people. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I mean it. I read them. Tell me where you landed. Tell me what you'd push back on. Tell me what surprised you. If you want to go deeper on any of the topics we covered today, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the manuscript evidence, the resurrection debate, let me know and we'll build a full video around it. Share this with someone you know who thinks the Bible isn't worth a serious look. Not to argue with them, just to say, here's more information than you might have had before. That's all we're doing here. More information, better questions, honest investigation. I'll see you in the next one.